together. Mary started off by saying how hard this was to research, and I hadn't realized quite how hard it was going to be to sum it up and to provide the next steps. And I think just in the scale of this problem, we have seen Lawrence Bond silenced as he tried to make a point, which has never happened before. And I think we saw Professor Mary Murphy having to make her comments from the naughty step. So I think the scale of the challenges ahead of us, I think, is very clear. What was really valuable was really, really interesting research, and all the respondents have highlighted it. But just from my point of view, the link that Mary's work has always had, and the people who work with it, linking this theoretical concepts with practical work is really, really powerful for our sector. And I think that's a very important contribution. It raises real challenges, as Stacia has said, real problems, but it is potentially very, very powerful for us. I think another thing is that I'll come back to this at the end, but we tend to see ourselves in the context of the United Kingdom and what the Department of Finance say, and to begin to broaden to see a wider perspective of different people who approach this in different ways is really, really important. There was reference to the slippery slope. One of the risks of the slippery slope is that when you look down the slippery slope, which I hope James Rees wouldn't be insulted for me by saying that England represents the slippery slope, when you look down it, you find yourself often slipping down it as you look to see what's the worst that can happen to us. And so broadening the context, both in terms of international, and then the 4 cases are taken from very, very different sectors, very different departments, different agencies, different parts of the community and voluntary sectors, I think is really useful. But perhaps the most significant thing, I think, is it brings the debate into the open, which is hidden. Organisations like the one I work for, Focus Ireland, and many others who are involved in this process can't really talk about it, because if you win a tender, you've got to get on with it, and you're silent about it. If you lose a tender and you discuss the issues around that, you look as if you're acting in bad faith, sour grapes. And so to bring this into the open is a really, really important contribution. I think the points that I think all the respondents made about language are really, really valid. And you hear in terms of what area we're talking about. We were talking about civic society, civil society, human services, we're talking about CSIs, we're talking about public services, we're talking about the most marginalized, we're talking about the care sector, and a range of other ones. Those are all very different things. So when we're talking about what are the next steps, that question of which of those things, I don't mean one, but which several of them, and how we're talking about them, and how we want to explore this further, because what is an appropriate response in terms of tendering is very different in all those sectors. And I think Stacia is quite right to point out that some of this is just descriptive, and you've got these different languages trying different things, but some of it is very already valued language. But I do think there is a real question there in terms of change, is we can't just talk about it in our own language. If we want to engage with the way things are currently done, we also have to understand and engage in the language which is used by the marketeers, if you like, so that we understand it and we sort of engage in it without ourselves falling into the trap. I think Stacia is right to point out there is a trap there of becoming absorbed by the language. So I think that's a very tricky. So what I've been asked to do is to suggest some sort of next steps. And I'm not sure whether the next steps are for the researchers or the next steps are for the sector or whatever. But broadly speaking, what's emerged, what I'm thinking about as I'm talking, as I'm listening to it, is the context for the next steps has got a number of different dimensions to it. There is a new government. There is certain things in the programme for government that are there which can be used at, and let us say there are things which aren't mentioned which should be seen as opportunities. We have a minister for charities who has a long-term experience working not in the voluntary sector, and also in working some of the frontline issues around racism and homelessness. So there is definitely an opportunity there for some possibility of change. All change governments represent a possibility for hope, even though not always fulfilled, but I think that's really important to say. I also think that there's this discussion that has come up a lot, that what is the impact of the COVID-19 crisis and the way that the sector responded to that. And there's been various mentions, I think, of the way in which this sector, community and voluntary sectors, have responded to this, and the huge benefits, and the community itself has responded to this, and it powers notions of public interaction and civic interaction and so on. Less mentioned, but really important to mention, is it really showed up the frailties of the private for-profit sector. And people seem to be less comfortable talking about that. I mean, less so here because we use it less, but PCW have been the answer to everything for so many years, and their colleagues, bring in these big accountancy companies. Well, they look at what they've done in terms of tracking and what the COVID response is in Britain. They obviously have huge things to offer, otherwise they wouldn't be so profitable, but they are being asked to do things which are well beyond their remit and are better done, not just by different organizations, but with organizations with different motives. And I think that's a really important issue when we talk about marketization of this whole issue. So I think about 5 things I had to say then about what I think are the next actions. And the first one that I think emerged from all the responses is this broader context that needs to be seen. We can't just talk about the question of tendering or procurement and so on. Really what we're talking about here is the funding of the entire sector, whatever sectors we're talking about. So I don't think there's anybody, well, I suspect there isn't anybody who thinks that the other ways of funding the sector are unproblematic. Was the era in which Atlantic Philanthropies was funding so much of it through their sort of mechanisms, was that some sort of halcyon day where things were great? Is the grant system, which was put up, as Anne, I think, was saying, yes, grants are still in place for some services. Well, is this grant system that the state uses to fund these sort of services in any way ideal? So we mustn't, so this is really important discussion, but I think it needs to be seen as a much wider question of how does this fit into the question of how these things are funded, which leads you on to the question of what are these things? I'll come back to that. A number of the respondents correctly said, I think, that what you can lose from this discussion is how, and Larry put it first, that this is not really about what's the impact on the service providers, it's what's the impact on the service users, and Ola brought in a gender analysis on that, and Stacia brought in one of ethnicity and racism, and so on. I think those are all crucial. And add to that, but there was somebody mentioned that it's not about the workers. I think Ola's comment that so many of the workers in the sector working with the disadvantaged are in fact women, indeed probably right across public services. There probably isn't another sector of the economy where people, broadly speaking, coming from the sector that are probably listening into this, would dismiss the interests of the workers and says, well, the workers are important, aren't important. The terms and conditions of the workers in the communities and voluntary sectors or new service sectors or the human services sector, whatever, are as important and a matter of rights as the workers in every single other sector and should be asserted as extremely important. And this particular process we're discussing here, as comes out in the research, undermines the rights of workers in a extremely important way. And the absence of trade unions in this discussion, in my own sector and other sectors, I think is striking and is one of the steps that needs to be remedied. I just want to say something in terms of the advocacy question. I think there was a really useful discussion on that. It's worth looking back at the work that the Advocacy Initiative did on that and the sort of the 4 dimensions of advocacy that were talked about there. The one which Mary was referring to, which is self-advocacy, which when I first heard it, I thought sounded weird, but it refers exactly to the importance of being able to speak up for yourself. Then there's the individual private advocacy, when you're pushing somebody's individual case within the system. And then there's the public policy advocacy, which is, I would argue, is the way in which you ensure that the equity goes with the personal advocacy, that you don't just deal with one case, you deal with how it affects the whole area of public policy. And then there is, I think, which Stacia's referred to, is essentially the transformative advocacy, which is the social movements and the demands for big change. And the questions of how those are funded and how they relate to funding mechanisms are completely different in theory, but in our reality of Ireland, partly because it's a small state and for other reasons, they massively overlap and make the whole thing extremely complicated to understand. So, like in many of the health disability organizations, the question of whether their advocacy was curtailed by the funding or not was a really complex question. It was in effect and in their minds, but you couldn't often find out where it was written down. And in recent years, we've come across very similar things in the homeless sector, though I hope that our outspokenness would lead you not to have thought that was going on. So the question then of, essentially the bit of this larger question that we're talking about is about marketization. And I think the language here is also interesting. I've always thought that this EU regulations around services of general interest was a bizarre title, because generally the services that we want are services of general total and utter indifference rather than general interest. And in the Irish context, some of the groups that you're looking at here are really striking in that regard. We aren't talking about privatization of public services. In the Irish context, you're talking about the marketization of what were voluntary services. So homeless, like the scale of the voluntary homeless services in Ireland is because homelessness has largely been ignored by the state itself, other than county homes if you go back far enough. But then it's voluntary organizations come in and fill that gap as volunteer organizations. And as they seek funding, initially they get it through grants, and now the government, various policies are going on to move it into this market system. And it does bring private actors into the case in the delivery of emergency accommodation to a very large extent, and folks are going to be talking about that next week. But I think that sort of background of the history of it and calling some of this stuff privatization, it misconceives what's happened. It is about this question of how we fund services, deliver services and fund professional services to people who are not market actors, who have no money, who have no political power, who are marginalized. And that is a really complicated question. And it means that the answer to the question of which services are best delivered under which funding regime, whether it be grants or whether it be competitive tendering or different forms of tendering, is a very complex one. So I think for me, the last thing on that part before I move to just close is I just wanted to identify the point that was made by Kieran, because I think is crucial, is the extent that process that I described, where you start from organizations start off as volunteers and then professionalize and then you move them into this, leaves people who are voluntary boards actually as risk takers. And you can argue yes or no about private-public partnerships where the state is trying to move risk to for-profit actors in the private sector. And one of the issues there is the pro-profit actors in the private sector are damn sight better at pushing risk onto other people than the state is. But it's a different issue here. The state is trying to push risk in this case onto non-profit actors, or people who have got lots of burdens on them, but are not there in any way. Their motivation is entirely different, and that is a really important point. So the two areas I think would emerge to me as the real areas of action, and one of them really picks up what Noel was saying a moment ago, which is the first thing to do to make this meaningful is to win the argument that it's even worth having this conversation. If the Attorney General and everybody in DEPA and finance and all our public institutions, our local authorities, all thinks that this is just irrelevant, and a man in Europe or a woman in Europe said that we've got to do it this way and end of story, then all the discussion we might have here is entirely irrelevant. And so this international comparison and winning the argument that we're allowed to do it and there are better ways of doing it at that high level, I think is important. I listened to Mary's answer about this, and I accept absolutely that part of the problem here is our centralization and the lack of authority and power in local authorities. Any solution to any problem which includes the statement, first we have to reform local government, is too long ago. So yeah, I heard that in homelessness as well. First, we have to reform homelessness. Homelessness is an easier problem to solve than reform of local government. I know Mary isn't saying that. I'm being polemic, but I do think that the centralisation is an opportunity as well. Because if you can find the 5, probably men and women who believe this and actually convince the change, there is possibility of much more substantial change than they have it diffused. But I think that we do need to win that argument. And then the second part of what I think might be a really useful practical thing to explore, and it comes up in a number of the comments and questions, is will you outline 3 possible responses to this, which are basically avoid, mitigate, and transform. You use sort of slightly different language there. It might be useful to try, rather than trying to sort of theoretical discussion of what's civic society and what's human services and what's the public service, to try and think, well, what would be the criteria you would look at in terms of particular types of services, particular types of potential beneficiary of services, and where they say, as to which of those responses might, what's the criteria would you use to decide which sort of services would fit under each of those 3 categories and why, and draw it back from that sort of very practical discussion, which allows you to bring into play the potential benefits that exist in some of these areas, as well as the deficits in a very practical level, which feeds into your theoretical framework, but would allow the people at the front line to have productive contribution or participate in that discussion. So that wasn't too long, and haven't lost too many people. And thank you very much for the opportunity to respond and to listen to the very interesting research.